I've always been cautious about driving at night. It's not the darkness that scares me. It's what might be hiding in it. After what happened that night in late 2019, I'm even more careful. I was heading home from visiting my parents in a small town about 4 hours away. The drive was long but familiar, and I'd made it countless times before. My parents had begged me to stay the night, warning me about the weather. Storms were forecasted, but I didn't listen. I had work the next morning and didn't want to risk oversleeping. The first couple of hours were uneventful. The highway stretched out endlessly, the occasional flash of lightning in the distance breaking the monotony. Then I saw him. It was near midnight when my headlights caught a figure walking along the shoulder of the road. He was wearing a tattered hoodie and jeans, his face obscured by the hood. I slowed down instinctively, my stomach knotting with unease. Picking up hitchhikers wasn't something I did, especially not at night. But as I drove past him, he turned his head, and for a split second, I saw his face. He was smiling, not a friendly, grateful smile. No, this smile was too wide, too unnatural. It sent a chill down my spine. I pressed the gas pedal and drove on, trying to convince myself it was nothing. The road ahead was dark and empty, the storm clouds blocking out the moonlight. I turned up the radio, hoping some music would calm my nerves. But after about 10 minutes, I saw him again. The hitchhiker. He was standing farther down the road, in the exact same position, hood up, head tilted slightly, that eerie smile still plastered on his face. My blood ran cold. There was no way he could have gotten ahead of me. I didn't stop. This time, I didn't even slow down. I kept my eyes on the road, refusing to look at him as I passed. But as my car sped by, I felt it, a faint pressure, like someone had tapped on the window. I slammed on the gas, my heart pounding. The rearview mirror showed nothing but darkness, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. The rain started about an hour later, a steady drizzle that quickly turned into a downpour. The wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear, and the sound of the rain against the car was deafening. Then, through the blur of water on the glass, I saw him again. This time, he was standing in the middle of the road. I hit the brakes, my tires skidding on the wet pavement. The car came to a stop just a few feet from where he stood. He didn't move. For a moment, I just sat there, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. Then he did something that made my blood freeze. He waved. It wasn't a friendly wave. It was slow, deliberate, and mocking. His head tilted further to the side, that twisted smile never leaving his face. I reversed the car, my heart racing as I tried to put as much distance between us as possible. When I looked back at the road, he was gone. I didn't see him again for the rest of the drive. When I finally pulled into my driveway, I sat in the car for a long time, trying to calm down. But as I stepped out of the car, I noticed something that made my stomach drop. There were wet footprints leading up to my front door. I stood frozen, the rain soaking through my clothes as I stared at the tracks. They were unmistakable, bare feet, slightly smudged from the rain. My hand shook as I unlocked the door and stepped inside, locking it quickly behind me. The house was dark and silent, the kind of silence that felt heavy, oppressive. I checked every room, every closet, even under the bed. Nothing, but the feeling of being watched didn't leave me. That night, I barely slept. Every creak of the house made my heart race. Every shadow seemed to shift when I wasn't looking. When morning finally came, I stepped outside to inspect the footprints again. They were gone. I tried to move on, telling myself it was just my imagination playing tricks on me. But a week later, something happened that I couldn't explain. I was leaving for work early in the morning, the sun just starting to rise, when I noticed something on my car's windshield. It was a single piece of paper, soaked from the morning dew. In shaky, smudged handwriting, it read, "Thanks for the ride." I stared at the note, my blood running cold. My mind raced, trying to make sense of it. I hadn't given anyone a ride. Had someone been in my car without me knowing? I checked the locks and the trunk, but everything seemed normal. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been there. That night, I installed security cameras around the house. For weeks, nothing happened. No strange notes, no footprints, no signs of the hitchhiker. I started to convince myself that it was all over. But one night, around 2 a.m., my phone buzzed with an alert from the security camera. I opened the app, my heart sinking as I saw the live feed. The camera facing the driveway showed a figure standing next to my car. It was him. He was staring directly at the camera, his hood pulled up, that same unsettling smile on his face. Then, slowly, he raised his hand and waved. I called the police, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. The officers didn't find any footprints, no signs that anyone had been there. The cameras didn't capture him leaving. One moment he was there, and the next, the screen went black for a split second. It's been 3 years since that night, and I still see him sometimes. Not in person, but in dreams, in reflections, in the corner of my vision when I'm driving at night. I don't know who or what he was, but I've learned one thing. If you ever see a hitchhiker smiling at you in the middle of the road, don't stop. And whatever you do, don't look back. I've always been a night owl, which made my job as a long-haul courier perfect. I could drive for hours under the stars without a second thought. The roads at night had a certain calmness, a stillness that I found comforting. But one night in 2021, that calmness turned into something else entirely, something I'll never forget. It was a routine trip from Billings, Montana, to a small town just over the Wyoming border. The route was familiar, a straight shot down the highway with little to no traffic at that hour. I had an overnight package to deliver and planned to be back home by dawn. The first part of the drive was uneventful. The radio played softly, and the occasional passing truck broke the monotony. But as I approached a stretch of road bordered by dense woods, things began to feel off. It started with the signs. The first one I noticed was a speed limit sign. Its numbers faded, and the reflective coating dulled with age. That wasn't unusual. This was a back road, after all. But then I saw another sign a few miles later, this one pointing toward a gas station. The thing was, I'd driven this route dozens of times before, and I'd never seen a gas station along the way. A creeping unease settled in as I continued driving, the road stretching endlessly ahead. The woods seemed to grow denser, the trees looming taller and darker. Even with my high beams on, the edges of the road dissolved into shadow. About an hour into the drive, I noticed the mile markers were out of order. One read, mile 47, and then, just minutes later, mile 12. I slowed down, my hands tightening on the wheel. Maybe I was just tired, my eyes playing tricks on me. But when I checked the dashboard, the clock hadn't changed. It was as if time itself had paused. That's when I saw the car. It was parked on the shoulder, an old, beat-up sedan with its hazard lights flashing. I slowed to a crawl, debating whether to stop and check if the driver needed help. But as I got closer, I saw that the car was empty. The driver's door was open, and a set of footprints led from the vehicle into the woods. I rolled down my window slightly, calling out, "Hello? Anyone there?" The only response was the sound of the wind rustling through the trees. Against my better judgment, I pulled over and stepped out of the truck. The night air was biting cold, and the silence was almost oppressive. I followed the footprints to the edge of the woods, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. They stopped abruptly, as if the person had been lifted straight off the ground. A chill ran down my spine as I turned back toward the road, only to find that my truck's headlights were no longer visible. The truck was gone. Panic set in as I stumbled back to where the vehicle should have been, but the spot was empty. The road stretched endlessly in both directions, with no sign of another car, let alone my own. I stood there, my breath fogging in the cold air, trying to make sense of what was happening. Then, in the distance, I heard it, a faint humming noise, low and steady, growing louder with each passing second. The sound seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating through the trees. As it grew louder, I realized it wasn't a hum. It was an engine. A pair of headlights appeared on the horizon, moving impossibly fast. Relief washed over me at the thought of another vehicle, but that relief quickly turned to dread as the lights grew closer. They weren't attached to a car. The lights hovered a few feet above the ground, their glow unnatural, casting long, jagged shadows across the trees. I stumbled backward, tripping over a rock as the lights came to a stop just yards away. Then, a voice. It wasn't loud, but it was clear, calm and cold, cutting through the silence like a blade. "You're not supposed to be here." I froze, my flashlight trembling in my hand. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice shaky. The lights blinked out, leaving me in total darkness. I scrambled to my feet, running blindly down the road. The sound of my own footsteps echoed in the silence, but I could feel something behind me, an unseen presence closing in. When I glanced back, the lights were there again, hovering silently in the distance. The voice came again, closer this time. "Turn back." I didn't stop running until I saw it, a small diner, its neon sign flickering faintly through the fog. I stumbled inside, the warmth of the place a jarring contrast to the icy terror I'd just felt. The diner was empty, save for a man behind the counter. He looked up as I entered, his eyes narrowing. "Rough night?" he asked, his voice gravelly. "You could say that," I replied, collapsing into a booth. I explained what had happened, but the man just shook his head. "You must have taken the wrong turn," he said. "This stretch of road, it's not on any map." "What do you mean?" I asked, my heart sinking. He leaned in closer, his voice dropping to a whisper. "People who find this road, they don't usually make it out." Before I could respond, the sound of the engine returned, louder and more menacing this time. The lights appeared outside the diner, their glow seeping through the windows. The man's face went pale. "You need to leave. Now." He pointed toward the back door, and I didn't hesitate. I ran out into the night, the cold air stinging my face as I sprinted toward the woods. The lights followed, weaving through the trees like they were alive, their glow casting eerie shadows that danced around me. My legs burned as I ran, branches tearing at my clothes and skin. Just when I thought I couldn't go any farther, I saw it. A break in the trees, the faint outline of my truck parked on the road. I didn't question how it had gotten there. I just climbed in, started the engine, and drove. When I finally reached the main highway, the fog lifted, and the stars reappeared in the sky. I didn't look back. To this day, I avoid that stretch of road. I've tried to find it again on maps, but it doesn't exist. And sometimes, late at night, when the road ahead seems too quiet, I swear I can hear the hum of an engine in the distance. Driving at night was something I'd always enjoyed. The quiet roads, the hum of the engine, the solitude. It had become a kind of ritual for me after long, stressful days. But after what happened that one night, I've learned that not every road is meant to be driven, and not every night is as empty as it seems. This happened in 2020 when I was driving from Chicago to a small town in southern Wisconsin to visit my sister. The drive was about 4 hours, and I'd planned to leave in the afternoon, but work ran late, and I didn't hit the road until after 10 p.m. By then, the highway was mostly empty, just the occasional pair of headlights in the rearview mirror. At first, it was relaxing. Just me, my favorite playlist, and the steady glow of the streetlights. But as I left the city behind and merged onto a quieter stretch of highway, a dense fog began to roll in, swallowing the road ahead. It wasn't just any fog. It was unnervingly thick, the kind that seemed to absorb the beams of my headlights. The edges of the road disappeared into a blur of gray, and I had to slow down to a crawl just to stay in my lane. I was about an hour into the drive when I noticed the first odd thing. In the distance, through the fog, I saw what looked like a figure standing on the shoulder of the road. At first, I thought it was a hitchhiker, but as I got closer, I realized it was a man in a suit. He was standing perfectly still, facing my car. His hands hung limply at his sides, and his head was tilted slightly, as if he were watching me. I passed him slowly, my pulse quickening as I tried not to make eye contact. Something about him felt wrong. His face was pale, almost gray, and his eyes seemed to glint unnaturally in the light of my high beams. By the time I glanced in the rearview mirror, he was gone. I shook it off, convincing myself that the fog was playing tricks on my mind. Maybe it was just a tired traveler waiting for a ride. But then I saw him again. It was only about 10 minutes later when I spotted him ahead of me, standing in the exact same position, facing the road, motionless. My stomach dropped. How had he gotten there so quickly? I slowed down again, my hands tightening on the wheel. This time, I kept my eyes locked on him as I drove past. His face was the same, expressionless, with those unsettling glinting eyes. I glanced in the mirror again. He wasn't there. By now, my unease had turned into full-blown fear. The fog seemed to grow thicker with each mile, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. I turned off the music, hoping the silence would help me concentrate, but it only amplified the pounding of my heart. Then, through the mist, I saw a faint glow, an old rest stop sign. Relieved, I pulled off the highway and parked near the small building, which looked like it hadn't been updated in decades. The lot was empty except for an old pickup truck parked near the entrance. The lights inside the rest stop flickered faintly, casting long, distorted shadows. I went inside, grateful for the brief escape from the fog. The fluorescent lights buzzed overhead, and the smell of stale coffee filled the air. I grabbed a cup from the vending machine and sat down at one of the plastic tables, trying to shake off the lingering dread. That's when I saw him. He was standing outside, just beyond the glass doors. The man in the suit. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at him, his figure barely visible through the fog. He wasn't moving, just watching me. I jumped to my feet, spilling the coffee as I backed away from the table. My first instinct was to run, but my legs felt like lead. Then he stepped forward. The automatic doors slid open with a soft hiss, and the man took a single step inside. "Can I help you?" I blurted out, my voice trembling. He didn't respond. His eyes locked onto mine, unblinking, as he took another step closer. That's when I noticed his hands. They were unnaturally long, the fingers almost skeletal, with nails that looked sharp enough to cut. I bolted past him, sprinting toward my car. The fog seemed thicker now, clinging to my skin like a heavy blanket as I fumbled with the keys. I jumped in and locked the doors, my chest heaving as I started the engine. When I looked up, he was gone. I sped out of the lot, my tires skidding on the wet pavement. The fog swallowed the road ahead, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away as possible. As I merged back onto the highway, my phone buzzed in the cup holder. It was a text from an unknown number. "You can't outrun me." My hand shook as I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat. The rest of the drive was a blur. I didn't see the man again, but the feeling of being watched never left me. When I finally arrived at my sister's house, I was too shaken to explain what had happened. The next morning, I checked my phone, hoping to find some explanation for the message. But the text was gone. I don't know who or what that man was, but I've avoided driving at night ever since. And sometimes, when the fog rolls in, I can't help but feel like he's still out there, waiting. There was something peaceful about the empty roads, the hum of the car, and the stars overhead. But one night, while driving back from a work trip, I learned the hard way that some roads aren't meant to be traveled after dark. It was a Friday night in November, and I just wrapped up a long day of client meetings in a small town 2 hours away. My plan was to drive straight home, get some sleep, and enjoy the weekend. But as I left the city and merged onto the winding country roads, a thick fog began to roll in, blanketing everything in gray. At first, it didn't bother me. My car's headlights cut through the mist well enough, and the road was straightforward. But as the miles passed, the fog grew denser, swallowing the trees and road signs. Soon, I could barely see more than a few feet ahead. That's when I saw him. He was standing on the shoulder of the road, just barely visible in the glow of my headlights. The man was tall and thin, dressed in what looked like a suit, though it was hard to tell through the fog. He wasn't walking, just standing there, perfectly still, facing the road. I slowed down instinctively, my heart pounding as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt. There was something off about him. As I passed, I couldn't resist glancing at his face. He was smiling. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was too wide, almost unnatural, like he was mocking me. I drove on, my pulse racing. I tried to shake off the encounter, telling myself he was probably just some eccentric local or a hitchhiker waiting for a ride. But something about the way he stood there, motionless, didn't sit right with me. About 10 minutes later, I saw him again. This time, He was standing in the middle of the road. I slammed on the brakes, my tires screeching as the car skidded to a stop. The man didn't move. He just stood there, smiling that same unsettling smile, his head tilted slightly to the side. I honked the horn, but he didn't flinch. Heart pounding, I reversed the car, intending to turn around, but when I glanced back at the road, he was gone. I didn't stick around to figure out where he went. I floored it, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The fog seemed to grow thicker, pressing against the windows like a living thing. My high beams were almost useless, the light bouncing back at me in blinding bursts. Then, out of nowhere, my phone buzzed. The screen lit up with a message from an unknown number. "Why are you running?" My stomach dropped. How could anyone text me out here? I didn't have service, and I hadn't told anyone where I was going. Another message came through, "You can't escape." I tossed the phone onto the passenger seat, my breath coming in shallow gasps. I didn't want to stop, but I couldn't ignore the growing unease in my gut. The car felt too small, the air too thick. After another mile, I spotted a gas station up ahead. Relieved, I pulled into the lot and parked near the pumps. The place looked abandoned. No other cars, no lights inside, just a flickering neon sign that read, "Open." I stepped out of the car, the cool night air biting at my skin. As I approached the door, I glanced back at the road. He was standing at the edge of the parking lot, the man in the suit. His smile was gone now, replaced by a blank, almost curious expression. He didn't move, didn't blink, just watched me. I stumbled into the gas station, my heart hammering in my chest. The cashier looked up from his phone, raising an eyebrow. "You okay?" he asked. "There's a guy out there," I said, my voice shaking. "He's been following me." The cashier frowned, glancing toward the windows. "I don't see anyone." I turned to look, and sure enough, the man was gone. The cashier shrugged, clearly unimpressed. "Probably just some weirdo. You need anything?" I nodded numbly, grabbing a coffee from the self-serve counter. But as I approached the register, my phone buzzed again. The message was short, "I'm inside." I froze, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. The cashier noticed my reaction. "What's wrong?" Before I could answer, the lights flickered, plunging the store into brief darkness. When they came back on, he was standing at the far end of the aisle, his head tilted, that awful smile back on his face. I dropped the coffee and bolted for the door, my shoes squeaking against the tile. The man didn't chase me, but I could feel his eyes on me as I sprinted to my car. I jumped in, locked the doors, and peeled out of the lot, my tires kicking up gravel. The rest of the drive was a blur. I don't remember how I made it home, but when I finally pulled into my driveway, the sky was beginning to lighten. I locked every door and window in the house, drawing the curtains and checking them twice. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching. And sometimes, late at night, I see his face in my dreams, smiling. I've never liked driving alone at night. There's something unnerving about the dark, empty roads, the way the headlights illuminate only a few feet ahead, leaving the rest of the world shrouded in shadow. But sometimes, you don't have a choice. That's how I found myself on a deserted stretch of highway one cold December night in 2018, with nothing but static on the radio and the hum of the engine to keep me company. The trip was supposed to be simple, a 3-hour drive from my friend's place in the city back to my small hometown. I'd done it plenty of times before, but I'd never left this late. By the time I hit the highway, it was close to midnight, and a light snow had begun to fall. At first, the drive was uneventful. The road stretched out before me, a straight shot with no other cars in sight. The snowflakes danced in the beams of my headlights, and the occasional road sign broke up the monotony. But as the miles ticked by, I started to notice something strange. It began with the headlights. I spotted them in my rearview mirror, 2 faint orbs of light far behind me, growing brighter with each passing minute. I thought nothing of it at first. After all, it was a highway, and it wasn't unusual for another car to catch up. But then the lights disappeared. One moment they were there, glowing steadily in the distance, and the next, they were gone. I frowned, glancing in the mirror again, but there was nothing behind me, just the empty road and the swirling snow. About 10 minutes later, the lights reappeared. This time, they were much closer, as if the car had suddenly materialized out of nowhere. A shiver ran down my spine as I tightened my grip on the wheel. I told myself it was just my imagination, that the snow was playing tricks on me. But no matter how many times I glanced in the mirror, the lights didn't fade. Then they began to swerve. At first, it was subtle, just a slight movement from one side of the lane to the other. But as I watched, the swerving grew more erratic, like the driver was drunk or losing control of the vehicle. I slowed down, hoping to let the car pass, but the headlights stayed right behind me, matching my speed. My heart pounded as I pressed the gas, determined to put some distance between us. For a moment, it seemed to work. The lights grew fainter, shrinking to tiny pinpricks in the distance. But then they disappeared again. Relieved, I took a deep breath, trying to shake off the tension. I reached for the radio, hoping to find something to drown out the silence, but all I got was static. That's when I saw her. She appeared out of nowhere, standing in the middle of the road. A woman in a white dress, her hair dark and wet, hanging limply over her shoulders. Her face was pale, almost glowing in the headlights, and her eyes were wide with fear. I slammed on the brakes, the tires screeching as the car skidded on the icy pavement. The woman didn't move. I came to a stop just a few feet from her, my heart hammering in my chest. For a moment, we stared at each other, her expression frozen in a mix of terror and desperation. Then she raised her hand, pointing toward the passenger side of the car. Against my better judgment, I rolled down the window. "Are you okay?" I called out, my voice trembling. She didn't answer. She just stood there, her arms still outstretched. "Do you need a ride?" I asked, unsure of what else to do. Slowly, she nodded. I unlocked the door, and she climbed in without a word. Her dress was soaked, and her bare feet left wet prints on the floor mat. The air in the car grew colder as she settled into the seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap. "Where are you headed?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. She didn't respond. I glanced at her out of the corner of my eye, hoping for some kind of explanation, but she just stared straight ahead, her face blank. "Are you okay?" I asked again, louder this time. Finally, she turned to look at me. Her eyes were dark, almost black, and her lips parted slightly as if she were about to speak. But before she could say anything, I saw them. The headlights. They were back, closer than ever, blindingly bright as they bore down on us. I pressed the gas, my pulse racing as the car accelerated. The headlights stayed right behind us, swerving wildly across the road. "What is that?" I muttered, more to myself than to her. The woman didn't answer. I glanced in the rearview mirror, my hands shaking on the wheel. The lights were so close now that I could make out the faint outline of a car. An old, rusted sedan with shattered windows. And then I saw the driver. His face was twisted into a grotesque grin, his eyes wide and unblinking. He stared directly at me, his mouth moving as if he were laughing, though no sound reached my ears. The woman in the passenger seat finally spoke. "Don't stop," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I wasn't planning to," I replied, my knuckles white as I gripped the wheel. But the lights grew closer, the car behind us picking up speed. "What do they want?" I asked, my voice breaking. The woman turned to look at me, her expression calm but sad. "They're looking for someone," she said. "Who?" Her eyes met mine, and for the first time, I noticed the tears streaming down her face. "Me," she said. The car behind us swerved violently, its headlights filling the cabin with blinding light. "Faster," she urged, her voice trembling. I pressed the pedal to the floor, the engine roaring as the car sped down the icy road. The lights followed, relentless, their glow seeping into every corner of the car. Then, just as suddenly as they'd appeared, they were gone. The road ahead was empty, the silence deafening after the chaos. I pulled over, my hands shaking as I turned to the woman, but the passenger seat was empty. The only sign she'd ever been there was the faint outline of wet footprints on the floor mat. I sat there for a long time, trying to process what had happened. Eventually, I started the car and drove the rest of the way home, the memory of her dark eyes and the man's twisted grin haunting me. To this day, I avoid that stretch of road. And sometimes, late at night, when the road is quiet and the air grows cold, I swear I see headlights in my rearview mirror. And I wonder if she's with me, trying to escape. There's a certain peace in driving at night, a solitude that lets you think without distractions. I'd always found it calming, until one night in late autumn 2020, when a quiet highway became the setting for the most terrifying experience of my life. I was driving back to my hometown from a business conference a few states over. The trip was a grueling 8 hours, and thanks to a delayed event, I hadn't left until well past 10 p.m. Still, I wasn't worried. The roads were empty, the weather was clear, and I had plenty of coffee and music to keep me company. The first few hours went smoothly. The highway stretched out in front of me like a dark ribbon, illuminated only by my high beams. The occasional car passed by, but for the most part, I was alone. That's when I saw the convoy. It started with a single pair of taillights in the distance. I caught up to them quickly, noticing they belonged to an old, beat-up pickup truck. As I passed, I glanced at the driver. He was a middle-aged man with a scruffy beard, wearing a baseball cap pulled low over his eyes. He didn't look at me, his gaze fixed straight ahead. Not long after, I saw another pair of taillights, then another. One by one, I overtook a series of vehicles, a station wagon, a sedan, and a semi-truck, all traveling at the exact same speed, their drivers staring straight ahead. It wasn't until I passed the fourth car that I realized something strange. All of the vehicles were identical to the ones I'd seen earlier. At first, I thought it was a coincidence. After all, it wasn't unusual to see similar cars on the road. But as I passed the fifth and sixth vehicles, my unease grew. Each driver looked the same. Expressionless, almost robotic, their hands gripping the wheel in an identical fashion. By the time I reached the end of the line, I was thoroughly spooked. I sped up, eager to put some distance between myself and the eerie convoy. But a few miles later, I saw them again. The same cars, the same drivers, the same lifeless expressions. I slowed down, my heart pounding. There was no way they could have gotten ahead of me, not without passing me on the road. I hesitated, unsure of what to do. My rational mind told me to keep driving, but my curiosity got the better of me. I pulled over onto the shoulder, watching as the convoy approached. As the cars passed, I counted each one, my stomach sinking with every familiar vehicle. The pickup truck, the station wagon, the sedan, the semi-truck. They drove in perfect unison, their headlights cutting through the darkness. Then something happened that made my blood run cold. The last car in the convoy, a black SUV, slowed down as it passed me. The driver turned to look at me, his face pale and expressionless. For a moment, our eyes met, and I felt a jolt of terror. His eyes weren't right. They were completely black, like two bottomless pits. The SUV sped up, rejoining the convoy, and I was left sitting on the shoulder, my heart racing. I stayed there for what felt like an eternity, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Finally, I worked up the nerve to get back on the road. I kept my speed steady, my eyes darting between the road ahead and the rearview mirror. The highway was empty, but the sense of unease lingered. Then, just as I began to relax, I spotted the convoy again. This time, they were ahead of me, their taillights glowing faintly in the distance. My first instinct was to slow down, to keep my distance, but something compelled me to catch up, to see if the cars were the same. As I closed the gap, my headlights illuminated the pickup truck at the front of the line. It was the same one I'd passed earlier, its bumper dented and its paint chipped, but there was no driver. I slammed on the brakes, my car skidding to a halt in the middle of the road. One by one, the vehicles in the convoy vanished, their taillights blinking out like extinguished candles. The highway was silent, the air heavy with an unnatural stillness. I sat there, gripping the wheel, my breath coming in short gasps. Then, from somewhere behind me, I heard the faint hum of an engine. The sound grew louder, accompanied by the glow of headlights in the rearview mirror. I glanced back, expecting to see another car, but what I saw instead made my stomach drop. The convoy was back, their headlights brighter than before, their engines roaring like thunder. This time, they weren't behind me. They were coming straight at me. I threw the car into reverse, my tires screeching as I sped backward down the highway. The convoy didn't slow down, their headlights growing blindingly bright. Just as they were about to collide with me, they vanished again, leaving nothing but the sound of my own ragged breathing. I didn't wait to see if they'd return. I drove the rest of the way home as fast as I could, refusing to look in the mirrors. When I finally pulled into my driveway, the first rays of dawn were breaking over the horizon. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the empty street, trying to convince myself it was over. But it wasn't. A week later, I received a letter in the mail. There was no return address, just a single sheet of paper with 4 words written in neat, black handwriting. See you next time.